Radio, sponsored by APICS Atlanta and Talent Stream. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia, Supply Chain Now Radio spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the companies, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. Now, here are your hosts.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Scott Luton live with you here on Supply Chain Now Radio. In today's live webinar, we're going to be discussing how to best implement a project in today's rapidly evolving supply chain environment. Our guest speaker today is Thom Sokol, manager of the supply chain practice at Collective Insights. More about Thom in just a moment. But as always, we're glad to have you with us here today on Supply Chain Now Radio. Okay, so we're going to tackle our ground rules. If we can, let's get back to display mode there. So ground rules are real simple. We always keep it very straightforward. All attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. Now, with that said, let's make it as interactive as possible. So please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar. We'll answer as many as we have time for at the conclusion of today's webinar. And finally, a PDF of today's presentation will be sent out to all the registrants in the next few days. Okay, moving right along, let's take a minute to recognize our sponsors here on Supply Chain Now Radio. Big thanks to our sponsor, APICS Atlanta, which has been serving the Metro Atlanta community since 1964. APICS Atlanta is a nonprofit industry association dedicated to the supply chain management space. To learn more, visit us at apicsatlanta.org. Special thanks to our sponsor, Talent Stream, a WeBank certified recruiting and staffing firm that specializes in helping organizations find top talent in the engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain space. To learn more, visit us at talentstreamstaffing.com. All right, our audience, you're in for a great treat today. Let's introduce our speaker. Thom Sokol is a supply chain professional with over 10 years of experience implementing complex and multi-disciplinary supply chain management technology projects. In fact, he's led over 20 full-cycle implementations and multiple million-dollar-plus projects. His expertise is in supply chain strategy, process manufacturing, warehouse management, distribution and logistics, and warehouse design. Thom has worked extensively in the areas of consumer goods and packaging, retail, manufacturing, pharma, and public transportation. He currently works with Collective Insights, a business consulting firm based out of Atlanta, where he is a manager in the supply chain practice. Thom holds his bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech and serves on the APICS Atlanta Executive Advisory Board. With all that said, here's Thom Sokol.
Thank you very much, Scott. I really appreciate the introduction, and it's an honor being here with you today to present the webinar. First off, I want to share a little bit about my background and also some of the goals of the webinar with you today. As Scott mentioned, I've led, consulted on, and been part of several dozen projects over my career, ranging from extremely small, just me and the client, to multinational projects with hundreds of team members and thousands of end users. I've also led or been a part of projects spanning many industries: pharma, retail, consumer goods, packaging, the public sector, and public transportation, just to name a few. And along the way, there's a couple common themes that I've found that either can make or break projects, or at least make them rewarding or nightmarish to implement. I developed a philosophy along the way. People and good communication are key in setting up projects to succeed. So I'll be covering 4 key topics today with you. First topic is going to be on project strategy. While we're not going to walk through all the details of how to set up a project, I do want to share a couple key perspectives on project design and solution design that oftentimes don't get a lot of attention. The second topic is going to be on change management. Change management doesn't always get a lot of press, but recently many companies are seeing the value in putting a concerted effort into getting change management done right. Here we'll cover topics that are often missed even by seasoned professionals. The third topic is going to be on team design. You can have a great project approach, great tools, great people, but are those the right people for the project? Are the incentives offered by the project going to make them happy and productive? And lastly, let's talk about partners. So you need some assistance on your project. It may be a small project, but your team is unable to reliably pull away from the business to execute, or perhaps this is a big project for a bigger organization. There are even more options now to staff your project, and let's discuss a few pointers on how to choose the right partners for your endeavor. So the first topic on project strategy is to discuss what project management methodology you'll be employing. You have to decide early in the project what approach you'll be following, either waterfall, agile, or some custom approach. And the main message and takeaway I want to give you is flexibility. Don't assume that you have to follow a strict waterfall or agile methodology on your project. Build your own approach. The goal here is not to go through the dozen components and steps and create a project charter for your project, for example. But I do want to cover a couple of methodologies at a high level and give you some pointers. So let's discuss the traditional waterfall approach first. This is your traditional project structure you see on the left. Something like initiate, design, build, test, deploy, and close. This all depends on the methodology you learned. If it's the PMI, the PMBOK, maybe it's the solution you're actually implementing. SAP Activate, for example, has its own terminology. But it also could involve your team's experience, what terminology they've used in the past. For example, I've encountered the terms realize, cut over, prepare, and many other terms used interchangeably with various project phases. It really doesn't matter what you call it, as long as everybody understands the phases that you're going to implement. The waterfall approach makes a lot of sense for projects that involve concrete events, for example, installing equipment, production line commissioning, projects with a concrete step-by-step flow. The key aspect of this is you don't start work on the next phase until the current phase is absolutely complete. You move to the next phase by passing either gates or checkpoints. The challenge with this approach is unless you can be confident that one phase is actually done and won't have to be revisited later, you might enter in a murky world of redesign, retest, redeploy, all without the structure of a project plan if things potentially go awry or happen to go awry on your project. Now let's discuss the Agile methodology that you see in the middle of the screen. Agile is a newer methodology and came into prominence around 2001 with the publication of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And as the name implies, it is of particular interest to the software development community. Even though it's focused on software development, it does have applications in the broader world. Examples of where Agile might be deployed include projects where the customer requirements cannot adequately be determined up front. Agile, simply put, is a method of iterative and incremental development. Instead of a big bang delivery of a product or a project, after a full design, build, test, and deploy cycle, the product is released to the customer in phases. The idea behind this is it reduces the risk of delivering a product that is not in sync with the requirements because either the requirements change frequently along the project or were hard to define up front. Now, one example of an Agile methodology applied to an ERP supply chain management project is going live with minimal functionality and building iteratively on this. For example, let's deliver warehouse management without any frills and solely add additional features such as directed put away and other advanced warehouse tools. Perhaps this would be done as the customer doesn't currently have these features but is interested in doing these or they're scoped into the project. Will they work? What will their returns be on the features? Well, it's hard to say sometimes at the very beginning. Well, let's get the critical stuff in first and then determine what to do next. So consider these methodology tools. It is your responsibility to fill the toolbox with the right tools. And oftentimes a pure approach is used as project managers familiar with one of the methodologies, but not necessarily others. Also, you'll never need the entire toolbox, just the right tools for your project. When I was first exposed to the PMI process, I was overwhelmed by the 1,000 tools and processes and procedures that I was introduced to. How will I ever use all these tools on a project without exceeding my budget, especially on small projects? Another example of going live with a customized approach. I managed a project a number of years ago for a medium-sized manufacturer implementing scheduling, master planning, and shop floor integration. The project was established as a traditional waterfall approach with a very aggressive timeline, and the customer kept on asking for more and more features during the build phase. The software is pretty complex and had a lot of flexibility in how it was implemented. The requests are valid, but we knew that if we started giving them everything they request, first off, it'd push the go live, but also we'd likely exceed the project budgets. So in that project, we instituted a strict change control process and convinced the client to allow implementation of non-critical features after the cutover. The project did go live on time, and that was a first for that client. And the budget was not exceeded. And then after they're live, they could better determine what features were really needed, and we followed an agile approach of delivering additional functionality bit by bit. And one final thought, you should always set expectations about your project approach with your team. If you say you're implementing an agile approach on a project, people will have expectations of what those tools and technologies are going to be. Be sure to explain any non-standard terms that you want to use to the team, but also revisit standard terminology, as they can then be reviewed to improve clarity to the team. The next topic to cover here is of particular interest to me because I often see this with myself and also my colleagues with engineering backgrounds. We really like detail. Can you recall a project that seemed overly complex for its size? I'm not saying complex. Rather, I'm saying overly complex for a reason. Many of those projects really are complex and require a dedicated project team, numerous project management tools, and a complex project plan, but not all of them. Oftentimes, project management itself suffers from scope creep, and a project plan becomes a detailed to-do checklist or even a repository of brainstorming ideas of what to do on a project or what could be done on a project. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it is very possible to under-project manage. No processes, no communications, no clear vision on where the project should be going. Really, the lesson learned is you really should be striving for some sort of middle ground and not, deviating too far one way or the other. As an example of some detail overload in a project approach, I was a member of a senior leadership at a software company a number of years back. And the company had upwards of several hundred small to medium-sized projects, but they happened to be complex projects on the fly at any one given time. However, due to the volume of the projects and lack of common project approach, visibility to management, executive management, and also the billing milestones and invoice triggers to the accounts receivable department were never really accurate. It was decided to go with an online Gantt tool, and all the projects were given templates that had to be modified and then maintained daily by each one of the several dozen project managers. This quickly became an overwhelming task, and actually compliance dropped, and visibility to leadership and also to finance took a turn for the worst. Some people even learned to game the system by putting in certain bits of information they thought would be visible to their boss, but by shirking other bits of data. In the end, the project plans were simplified back down to simple invoice milestones and major milestones on the project, and the control of the project detail was actually given back to the project manager. They ran the project as they saw fit, and the result was the compliance actually went up and the stress levels down on the team because people were back into compliance and they were able to work as they saw fit on the project. The lesson learned here is be cognizant of the complexity of your project and project management office structure. Be sure to design the project structure to provide the right level of detail and control, but don't micromanage. Be sure to come back to this topic throughout the project cycle, as it's always good to verify that things don't go awry during the process. This topic relates very closely with the previous two slides. Let's discuss the idea of the minimum viable product, MVP. MVP is a concept that arose from the lean startup methodology, a way to get products quickly into the market to get customer feedback on early designs. However, it has in several ways become associated with agile development and also project management. In the lean startup environment, oftentimes speed to market to gain market share or to test designs out so further development can be done is important. In a project management environment, it could mean configuring or building just enough to go live rather than waiting on the full product. The intent of this is to allow the customer to use the solution and give feedback. So as an example, let's revisit the example I gave earlier about the manufacturer with the accelerated timeline and talk about MVP there. The client, as mentioned, was operating on a very tight timeline with a very limited budget, and they were implementing a lot of new features they did not currently have on their shop floor in their business. Early in the project, we had a frank discussion with the client's leadership when we realized things might be going off track. They had to decide at that point if they wanted everything on their bucket list and face a likely go-live push or a budget overrun, or could they be happy going live with the basics and minimal functionality to get them up and running so they could check out determine then what to go with. They ended up deciding to keep with the go-live schedule and go with a minimal critical functionality, for instance, conveyor integration with the shop floor, but they left less critical features out for after the go-live, historical data loads for optimizing runtimes, for example. The result was, after the go-live, we had enough budget to revisit many of the features they were actually interested in. And as we developed the new features, we were able to test and then load into production successfully, seeing exactly how they're using the software and how the business is running. Many of the features the client thought were very needed prior to the go-live actually fell off their list when they saw the system in operation. They were able to test out the reports. A lot of the custom reports that they wanted fell off the need list when they saw the actual data in the system. And another example I have that illustrates this concept well is the remote control you see as on the screen here. Take these two types of remotes. One is a basic TV remote that you see on the right, and the other one is a universal remote that you see on the left. They serve completely different functions and have completely different capabilities. If you just need to turn on the TV, though, maybe change the channel, which one would you go with? The one on the right or on the left? Not to say that either one's a bad solution, but you have to make sure the right one is chosen. Now, have you ever seen a project or a solution that resembled the universal remote when you really just needed the basic remote? The complex remote type solution not only costs you more to deliver in the end, but also costs you more to maintain, and really might end up lowering your user satisfaction because they have to deal with a whole lot more buttons on this project than they really need. And as I alluded to in the example, one of the most powerful tools you can leverage as a project manager is the change control process. It doesn't have to be complex, but it does have to be robust and consistent. One of the best functioning change methodologies that I encountered was a simple spreadsheet done in Excel. But it was integrated in with the rest of the project management documents. Task lists, billing milestones, everything was all included in this Excel spreadsheet, and it was sent out frequently with up-to-date notes to the client. So it was an active document, not just sitting in a SharePoint site or a folder someplace. Not only was this documentation consistent and complete, but it was actively discussed with the client and with the project team. The most critical items and the ones impacting go-lives and other milestones were aggressively discussed until a game plan was established. One other component for controlling scope is to actually work with sales. Imagine that. Getting to know the people who supply you work. You may be able to influence the contract negotiation cycle and head off disastrous line items. One example at the technology company, we would occasionally get a project transition from sales including unlimited custom reports, which cost the project teams tons of time and tons of effort. These were complex reports to build in, and the risk was high because we had no idea whether to budget in time for one report or 100. But it took some negotiation with sales and to get that sales technique changed. In the end, we ended up getting either a fixed number of reports on projects where we could plan for our time, or at least they provided us a flexible budget, hourly bill rate, so we know that our time is going to be captured on the project. Many people have heard the statistic that 70% of change projects fail. But what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that 70% of your projects get canned halfway through? Well, perhaps you've experienced a failure, or perhaps you didn't even realize it at the time, because failure often means a failure to meet expectations, be that poor user satisfaction, or even negative leadership perception of the project. The project may have continued on to completion, but somehow something was off at the end of that project. Perhaps senior leadership isn't seeing the ROI they expected, or perhaps they're measuring success differently than the project manager or the project sponsor. Oftentimes, that failure is a failure of communication. You as the PM knew that the scheduling component of the solution that you're implementing was lacking, but you came up with a solution with the planners and had a perfectly valid manual solution in place that allowed an otherwise great tool to be implemented. No problem, right? Everything looking good. Well, the project sponsor isn't thrilled about abandoning what they saw as a key feature on the tool that they had purchased. On the other hand, perhaps failure is actually a go-live that the plant didn't know that was happening. How many projects have you done where you show up to the final training or go-live prep and you met for the first time an employee that you didn't think of talking to before, but they turned out to have tons of clout and responsibilities on the shop floor? At this point, you're trying to win over an employee who has a bunch of tribal knowledge about how things are done around there, and possible resentment for the suddenly introduced project that they were introduced to. So here's an example incorporating that extra staff late in the game. We were replacing the ERP in multiple plants on one project, and we just needed the input from one more forklift operator on how they transferred the project from one storage location to another. We found that employee had built a paper-based system years and years back. Not only that, but it was his baby. He was a few years from retirement, wasn't super quick on learning new technology and new handhelds, but he was absolutely terrified of losing his legacy, the paper-based system he put in, and also losing his job because of the new technology we were implementing as a project team. So we recognized at that point that special training was going to be necessary, and we also went a step further and incorporated him into the design process. We spent a lot of time coaching him, reminding him that his job was not in jeopardy, but he did have a responsibility to help the team on this project. And by the end of the go-live, by the time of the go-live, not only had we created a champion because of the extra time and effort spent on this one employee, it might have taken more time and more patience to implement, but we found one major surprise benefit, and that this guy had a lot of influence on the shop floor, and he started talking about the project in a successful way. He was excited about this project, and he was excited to be part of the process. So he became a huge influencer in talking with the rest of the folks operating the forklifts. And one of the thoughts that came out of was, hey, if Bob is a fan, yeah, hey, maybe I should be as well. So it really helped us out in the project in the long run. So these types of failures are mitigated by applying change management tools and techniques. And a lot of this comes down to communications. But do keep in mind, change management shouldn't be an afterthought, and it will require a certain amount of legwork to implement well. Some projects don't need as much. Some projects will need a ton of change management, and understanding this requirement will help you reduce your risk. So you may be thinking at this point, the odds are not stacked in your favor, right? So 70% seems like a pretty tough number to beat. So many ways a project can fail. How can you create success from this? Well, this, as I mentioned, is where change management often enters the picture. So I'm just going to focus on a handful of concepts in change management. And there are thousands of different change management techniques and principles out there, and you can go online and find out everybody and their dog has the top 10 type of change principles they'd like to share with you. But I'm going to focus on two types of change management failures that I've seen over and over on the project. The first type of breakdown is a communication breakdown. This is one of the most common forms of failure I've witnessed on projects. One would think that this is a pretty easy problem to fix, right? After all, communication, isn't it just talking more with your colleagues? In fact, it's a common failure point for a reason. Good communication is tough for most people and most organizations out there. The most common form of communication failure is the lack of outward and downward communication. This may include failure to adequately keep end users, customers, vendors, and other staff in the loop. And I've been a part of several projects where the client's project manager neglected to communicate out to all the stakeholders. This wasn't necessarily done out of carelessness. There was simply a lot going on in the project and a lot going on with their organization and a lot going on in their operations that they needed to keep track of, and it was simply dropped. But keep in mind, sometimes a simple email heads up to a customer, a walk the floor to get some buy-in from the forklift operators, or perhaps some basic planning to reduce your risk to your vendors will go a long way. Working on large supply chain. So one example that I ran across in the past, I was working on a large supply chain project in consumer goods where every aspect of the operations was getting transitioned over a weekend. The warehousing, the transportation, inventory, sales, everything was being affected. And I was project manager for one of the sites. The client was responsible, the plant was responsible for all their communications, and I was there to implement the software, coordinate training, support the go live, and also provide guidance and best practices. The client did a great job of communicating the upcoming change internally to the plant staff, but one thing they didn't think about doing was updating any of their third-party logistics, their 3PLs, on what's going to happen over that weekend. And at go live, there was a problem with the centralized planning department that was located off-site that handled all the work for multiple plants, and outbound shipments were detained at the docks or in the yard upwards of 10 hours. And in one case, one truck was in that yard for 24 hours. They could not escape. The 3PLs were rightfully ticked off when this happened. They had no idea that anything was going to happen to that plant. So while at the plant, we really couldn't avoid the situation. It was a centralized planning error. But they could have better maintained their relationships by keeping the transportation providers in the loop. Perhaps if the 3PLs knew that something was going on, they might have not have changed any of their deliveries that date, but they could have had a plan B in place, and they could have diverted some trucks ahead of time once they knew something was going down. The next type of breakdown is project fatigue. This is a common issue I've seen on projects, particularly long ones. But it's not necessarily just an issue with long projects, though. It can happen anywhere people are overloaded with work. And experience has taught me that this happens first and foremost when people are asked to take up a second job contributing to a project. It's exacerbated when that person has insufficient visibility into the project schedule or is subject to frequent changes in priority. The best way to avoid this is first to be receptive to feedback from the affected team members, but also keep them informed about their role in the project and where the project is going. One example of project fatigue, I was working a public transportation project a number of years ago, and this client was a particular challenge in that they did not want to take ownership of the project prior to go live. They weren't owning training, they weren't owning testing, and they kept on pushing all the work back on the software vendor for various reasons. Well, ultimately, when go live came around, they weren't prepared, and the go live did not succeed, and they had to roll back the software. A terrible mess all around. But afterwards, this is where the project fatigue part came in, because the project kept on rolling. We rescheduled the go live for later, but we found out the dispatchers, who were key project contributors, began to complain loudly about the extra work and about having to redo this. They started to shirk meetings and were generally very detached from from the project. Simply put, they were exhausted. They were tired of this project. So at this point, I pressed the client. They have to own their system, or we would not proceed any further on this. With the client facing a project shutdown, a bad deal for them, but also really for us as the vendor, they started to take an active role in ownership and communication. They spent more time chatting with various team members. They spent more time in the dispatch office, and they talked the employees that were exhausted back from the ledge. Ultimately, a few months later, the second go live did go okay, primarily because they took ownership and they started to communicate with their employees more. So another example of good communications and change management, we'll discuss some of the work we did at a large manufacturer with several dozen facilities going live at a time. So this was a huge project. We were responsible for the change management work on a project with several thousand end users. And this project was a several-year multi-deployment timeline. We established a communication plan as part of the change management, including communication kits developed by phase of the project. And these kits included items such as wall posters for break rooms at the facilities, one-pagers to help guide the managers at the sites in their messaging to their employees on how to update them on the project and what the project was about, but also timelines on how to release the kit. So it was a very, very detailed process that we set up and we followed and we had to execute. In the end, when we were surveying the end users, most of them, including remote staff at warehouses and plants way off in the boonies, were actually familiar with the project, and they felt knowledgeable going into it. They know where they fit in, and the number of unhappy employees was much lower than it could have been considering a project that size. So in summary, the greatest risk to your project, as I have in the slide, is the human side of the project. Maybe not the solution, it might not be the technical solution itself. So ultimately, the success in implementing these projects really means employing good project team members with good communication and interpersonal skills, as well as making sure that those employees have a sufficient change management experience. So now that we have our project design underway and we're currently working out what change management tools we need to employ, let's discuss your team itself. Now, I ask you, have you ever found yourself incredibly frustrated on a project that actually seems to be going pretty well? Perhaps you know a team member on that good project that just isn't comfortable with the rate of change and is struggling to keep a balance with their day job, or they're just not excited about the work anymore. Now, experience is you cannot simply take star employees from their role in the business and make them star project team members. Everyone has their own interests, ambitions, and their ability to say no to work that's assigned to them. Team members are often chosen by proximity and their technical skills. For example, hey, we need a process design person. Hey, and we know Bob over in the corner has done this before. Well, let's see if we can ask him to help out with this project. So let's discuss some of those aspects of team design that may come back to bite you on your project later on. So the goal here is to staff your project with team members who see the project as a good thing for, not only for the company, but also for their career and matches their interests. And in general, there's two ways to bring on staff onto a project. Either you can hire that person on explicitly by interviewing and going through a formal hiring process, and this includes hiring on internal candidates from your organization, or you can staff a project simply by assigning them to a project. And this is mostly referring to the folks in operations. So people being pulled from the business. The formal hiring option has a distinct opportunity to factor in not just the skills of the potential team member, but also their career ambitions and interests. The informal option, however, is used to select those oftentimes used to select those supporting team members, super users that are going to be like owning a process area at a plant, key SMEs who are needed to design a system, or staff to deliver training to end users. And these team members are often chosen informally. Using Bob as an example, hey, Bob knows how our procurement process works. Well, let's make him our procurement trainer for the new system at the plant. So let's focus on this informal process, as I found that has a higher chance of becoming a challenge on your project. First, let's discuss from where to staff your project. Topic 1. You have your core team already built. So the full-time project manager, the full-time project staff, but you still need people from the business to own and lead various items like end user training, go live coverage, etc., testing, for example. Well, some considerations to be taken into account. What is the workload? Hey, can they or should they still be doing their day jobs at the same time as the project? And do they value change in the new challenges, or do they really just want to leave the office at 5 o'clock every day and have a reliable schedule? Also, if you pull this person from their day job for a few months, how do you return them to work afterwards? Will they have the same job? What are their career ambitions and their growth goals for their job themselves? So my work on the software projects in the public transportation area offer a good example of how team selection and setting expectations is important. So the clients back in public transportation usually ran their very lean teams and were very operationally intense. It's a lot of dispatching, a lot of call taking, a lot of scheduling, and it was oftentimes very hard to pull these contributors from their day jobs to contribute on these software projects. This led to a lot of project waiting and delayed go-lives, waiting for people to become free. So towards the end of it, or after time, I started setting expectations with those clients, day one at kickoff, that who they choose to contribute on the project would have to spend a certain number of hours a week on the project. And I was forceful and very clear about this. Oftentimes, they would rethink who to put in the position knowing the commitment required. Maybe the dispatcher has more technical knowledge and system knowledge, but that person, we're not going to get him out. He's already doing 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, and barely has time for a cup of coffee. Hey, maybe we should pull somebody from a supporting organization with a little bit more flexibility, finance or IT. Even if that person didn't check all the boxes when it comes to technical skills or the business skills, hey, they still had the soft skills and they had the desire and the ability to learn on the project to help them succeed. And in the end, when we set these expectations up front, we generally didn't experience an awkward reshuffle of resources mid-project, as we generally had fewer stressed out and overworked employees. So another good example of good structure is the use of dedicated super users on large projects. We did this on one of our supply chain management projects we did recently. These staff would be pulled out of the business for the duration of the project, so several months at a time, and they were given enough time and bandwidth to focus on the project itself. And their position was backfilled either by other staff who were familiar with the work, or in some cases temps who could learn the job pretty quick. But that person always returned back to the business after their project was done. So the next topic, let's talk about the skill sets needed to execute a project. So it is important for most project team members to have a project background or at least some experience contributing to projects. And this is because projects do actually require a unique skill set. Operations generally operate on a steady daily, weekly, or monthly cadence. Folks at a plant are usually used to seeing the same thing like on a week to month to day basis, and they're generally a pretty stable job. Generally, there's always exceptions. But projects are sequential in nature, and oftentimes the level of uncertainty is a lot higher, and change is constant on a project. So a good skill to have on a project is the ability to embrace that change and also relay that change as a force for good and communicate that out to the rest of their team. So one of the examples I ran across where somebody didn't have the soft skills needed, I was leading an ERP deployment at one of the sites in a large multi-site project, and the plant manager had chosen a knowledgeable inventory manager who happened to have the most bandwidth of any of his team members to be a super user for that warehouse portion of the project. However, the plant manager didn't tell this person that they're going to have to teach the end users how to use the system after they themselves received the training. That individual literally had a panic attack the first day of teach back. They got in front of that class and they froze. They ended up being petrified of public speaking, even in front of their own colleagues. So, needless to say, the plant changed that super user for another inventory person shortly thereafter. It was better for the project, but the original person really didn't feel very great about the negative perception of being pulled from that project. And that leads us into the last topic, which is the career ambitions. Many projects are an opportunity for people to showcase their talent. You as the project manager or the sponsor should sell that. But while it might be an opportunity for some people, it is likely a burden for other people. Should you ask the seasoned inventory manager to lead a project or lead a portion of the project, or the enthusiastic new employee eager to make his mark? Does this person care to progress in their career? Not always. And to be honest, that is fine. I read a book a few months back called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And the book talks about the value of communication in your organization. And the book went on to describe the difference between what they call rock stars and superstars in your organization. Superstars, on the one end, they're your eager go-getters. They're excited about climbing the corporate ladder. They're excited to take on new responsibilities. And they're excited about everything new, but they might not be as interested in the less glamorous work of the day-to-day operations. The work that has to absolutely get done for your business to continue. Rock stars, on the other hand, these are your reliable, get the job done folks, and they may be very comfortable with their current responsibilities. And they might not be as eager to stretch and take on new work as they might perceive it risky, or they're at a point in their lives where they're not as interested in seeing that career growth. You can't have an organization of only rock stars or superstars. It just wouldn't work. You have to have both types of folks to get the work done, the day-to-day operations and also your organizational change. You need to make sure you assess where your project potential team members' interests lie, and beware of putting a rock star where a superstar should be on your project. Team design, in the end, doesn't stop after your team is built. You need to continue to maintain the team, and as the project moves along, make sure that people are still getting what they need out of the project. Perhaps this wasn't the gig that they signed up for, and you can offer some coaching to help them continue moving forward. And lastly, now that you have your project set up, your change management processes in place, and your internally sourced team established, you need some help. And there are many reasons why you might choose a partner. Bandwidth in your own organization to execute, or perhaps you need some specific skill sets added to your team. And recently there's been a change in how companies are leveraging the help of professional services companies and consultancies. There's more demand for value and a more critical eye on the services that are being provided. And I found one quote from The Economist magazine a few years back that I felt really summed up this change well. The big three have been masters of bundling lots of different services into a single high-price package. But clients are no longer interested and no longer want to pay fat fees for a bit of strategic advice from a senior partner and a lot of humdrum work from the neophytes. Well, this quote was referring to from the article McKinsey Consulting. And the article continued to go on and talk about how McKinsey was adapting to the new environment and the new expectations. So companies are oftentimes looking at utilizing smaller, more customer-centric firms and often precision targeting their projects. Consultancies themselves are changing as the need for nimble and focused expertise is needed rather than an army of help. And according to various studies on professional services, there are three general types of professional services firms that have developed. The first category, you see at the top, these are your high-level strategic firms. I think of the McKinseys out there. These are high-dollar, very strategic firms, very in tune with the overall market, but they might be less focused on the actual delivery of products. They're going to leave behind overall strategy of what you're looking for at a high price. The second category of traditional firms, these firms are focused on delivering services as a commodity. Think about an organization bringing in 10 people, 15 people to help test your software solution. They deliver a particular service with a standard methodology that is expected to maximize the value. And these are your armies of consultants. So think very rigid process, very focused on churning and burning through a project. But there's a rapidly emerging third category. These are firms with experience of the traditional consultancies, but with enough flexibility to allow them to deliver on strategy and execution. Oftentimes, these are smaller firms made up of employees from the traditional firms who could bring the same skill sets and same experience to the table without the overhead and without a strict methodology that you have to follow. This is not to say that there is not space for the traditional firms. On the contrary, they are doing fine and they'll continue to provide valuable services in the market. However, a larger portion of the market is being occupied by this new type of consulting. These new choices and options are a great benefit to customers who will get more value for their buck. And the key is to identify clearly your project's need before engaging external help. Each service company has its own strengths and weaknesses, and you knowing them before entering in a project with them is an absolute must. One challenge, however, might be finding a vendor in the sea of these smaller providers. It may be easy to find the big guys, but finding a smaller, more local firm might be more difficult. And another challenge, onboarding that smaller vendor through the procurement process in your organization might also be difficult. But depending on your company's procurement practices. But there also might be a push to lower bill rates and diversify your vendors, which might actually help out. So in closing out this webinar, I want to leave you with a few clear takeaways, perhaps a few easy wins you can bring to your project. First, customize your approach. Consider putting together a project plan that incorporates the right mix of agile and waterfall, and make sure you communicate that approach out to your team, sponsors, and customers. Also, make sure you design your project to the right level of detail for your project and your solution. And beware of an overly complex system resulting from poor change management processes. Next, make sure you focus on communication. Be sure to expand your communication channels to involve all stakeholders. Make a concerted effort to establish that list of stakeholders and craft a message that will keep them informed to reduce your project risk. And leverage them as potential partners so they can help find solutions if something goes wrong. Next, empower your people. make sure you take into consideration your team's motivations and career ambitions, not just their technical abilities and bandwidth. And lastly, spend time finding the right partner for your endeavor. Be creative in choosing a partner. There are many more options to choose from now, and make sure your partner focuses on the value that you're going to be given, not just the number of hours and people on your project. So in closing out, just a little bit about Collective Insights. Collective Insights is a full-service management and consulting firm. When we partner with our clients, we go all in. We become part of our client's culture, working side by side with management and team members to meet your organization's goals. Our company is known for designing and executing strategies that help clients better compete, whether it's change management, IT security, or supply chain. We deliver innovative solutions that meet their needs. So, Scott, that wraps us up here. I'm going to pass the baton back to you.
That sounds great. And to our audience, we're going to take the next 5, 7, 8 minutes. Who's counting? I have some questions for Mr. Thom Sokol. So this is your opportunity to ask a leading change agent and change leader some questions to pick his brain without getting an invoice. So use the opportunity. So, Thom, we've got a couple questions teed up. And again, to our audience, if you'd like to pose a question, just type your question or your observation in the chat toolbar, hit send, and I'll pose that to Thom verbally. So, Thom, first question comes from Sheila. Sheila asked, what are some challenges you faced managing a project with aspects of Agile and Waterfall? In particular, what tools, I guess, could you, I think she's asking, what tools helped you break through those challenges?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sheila. That's a wonderful question. Really, my experience in working with these custom project methodologies, they're the same challenges you would face in any project. Scope creep, communications breakdowns, silos, document management. Really, it's all the same kind of concerns that you'd have. But keeping a focus on the process will go a long way. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid, or silly. Keep an array log in SharePoint, for example. But the one thing I will say about some specific tools, there's a lot of really innovative tools out there, especially a lot of cloud-based tools that are designed explicitly for this customized approach. So while Microsoft Project, not picking on a particular tool, is a great tool and has a lot of uses still, definitely venture out and start looking at new tools online.
Terrific. And great question, Sheila. Thanks for your perspective there, Thom. Next question comes from Ika. Hey, Ika, good afternoon. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for tuning in. Ika asked, Thom, with a more global environment, what is your advice to effectively manage a project with a geographically dispersed team, different time zones, and potentially language barriers? So that's the first part of that question. Second part, from your experience, what project management tool is more suitable for managing such project?
Wow, that's a very pertinent question to these days. And I'm going to start off with an answer. This sounds like something silly, but I tell you, it's helped me on every single one of those multi-time zone, multinational projects. Whenever you set up a meeting or discuss setting a time with somebody, include your time zone in that time. Don't say meeting at 9 o'clock. Let's meet at 9 o'clock. That simple thing has helped me so many times on projects. But that being said, your online collaboration tools are going to be your best benefit, especially when working across multiple geographies. GoToMeetings, your WebExes, thousands of different online tools that you could use. But going back to the process and going back to the steps, if you're using SharePoint or even if you're using just a shared folder someplace out there, make sure that you know how you're going to leverage these tools with your project team members. Communicate that out. Nothing will go further than a simple half-page document, post it up on the root folder of a SharePoint site saying, here's how we're going to be using this, here's the overall structure, and here's how to find stuff. So leverage your online tools for sure on that.
Yeah, great question, Ika. Thanks for sharing that, Tom. One other thing I'd like to add to that. So as I mentioned on the front end, Tom is a member of our APICS Atlanta Executive Advisory Board. His firm, Collective Insights, also sponsors the APICS Atlanta chapter. One of our next executive roundtable session events, which have been really popular, our last one was conducted in February at Graphic Packaging International, where we huddled around the hot topic of S&OP. The next session in May, we're looking to tackle basically, Ika, your question, because in the modern day global supply chain, you got folks in South Georgia that are working with folks in Panama, that are working with folks maybe in Asia, and you've got to break through time zones. You got to communicate and bridge through cultural differences and gaps, all in the name of taking care of the customer and making it happen. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in May at our next executive roundtable session. So, Ika, I think your crystal ball is working well. So great question, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Next question, Tom. Let's see, Jenna. Jenna asks, what is the best way to select a team when you don't have a huge pool of candidates?
Absolutely. And I think we kind of talked a little bit about this, but some of the same techniques that we discussed. Make sure when you're working with a small team, I'm thinking back on some of the projects where I'm working with an agency of 4 or 5 people. They don't necessarily have the budget to hire on additional consultancies. I'm working with the software vendor. Make sure, even when your pool is small, make sure as a project sponsor on your side, you're still talking with those employees. Don't say, hey, I need you to help me out with this. We're starting next week. Don't let the conversation end there. Go ahead and go in and say, hey, I know this is going to be a little extra work on your plate. Are you okay with this? You make sure that you're approaching them from a soft skills perspective. Some people are just excited and will plow through anything given to them. But a lot of people out there, if asked to work on a project, they're not going to say no. They're going to say yes to avoid saying no. And then once the actual project gets underway, you find out, hey, this person's just really not got the bandwidth we're needed. So make sure you set up those communication channels right to ask those questions and be receptive to their feedback.
Fantastic. Great question, Jenna. And Tom, thanks for taking that question in stride. For the sake of time, we're going to wrap up Q&A at that point in time, Tom, and we're going to move right ahead into closing. Thanks for all the questions. Great questions, Sheila and Ika and Jenna. So thanks and again, Tom, thanks for that. That's one of my favorite parts of the live webinar is that you can engage and bring your questions to the table and get insight from subject matter experts. So thanks for taking the time to do that. So we're going to conclude the session this afternoon on a few final items. First off, Supply Chain Now Radio, if we move right ahead there, Supply Chain Now Radio is pleased to serve as a media partner for the AME 2019 Lean Summit, which is going to be conducted right here in Atlanta, May 6th through the 9th. You may be familiar with the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. This program will be featuring great speakers, outstanding plant tours, all focused around the manufacturing industry. Of course, great networking as well. Supply Chain Radio is going to be broadcasting live on site on May 6th, day one of the program, and you can learn more at ame.org, or you can shoot us a note and we'll make sure you have the information for that great event in May, just a couple weeks, about a month or so out. Next up, we want to make sure you're aware of I4Transport's 3PL and Supply Chain Summit here in Atlanta in June. EFT is bringing some of the biggest industry names right here to the Supply Chain City for 3 days of thought leadership and executive level networking. Again, we're pleased to be serving as a media partner. We'll be broadcasting live from the event. You've got Cisco, Uber Freight, Land O'Lakes, DHL Supply Chain, just a few of the dozens of companies and senior leaders that will be presenting. Be sure to check out Becker Logistics, who is sponsoring our live broadcast on the June 11th and June 12th, day 1 and day 2. And you can check out Becker Logistics at beckerlogistics.com. We're appreciative of their sponsorship. You can learn more about the events at events.eft.com, or you can click on that hyperlink that will be in the deck that we send out after this webinar. Lastly, check out our website for upcoming webinars, podcasts, and other events. You can check that out at supplychainnowradio.com, including our newest series, Today in Manufacturing, which is sponsored by the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance. In fact, you can check that out. Our first series was completed last week. Our first episode was last week. You can check that out at todayinmanufacturing.com, which is a direct landing page to that series. And as always, if there's anything we can do for you, serve as a resource for you, please shoot us a note to scott@supplychainnowradio.com. Okay, so Tom, before we conclude today's session, any final thoughts on your end?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Thank you. Really quickly, I know there's a lot of time and energy spent on discussing the technical solution on your project, what the solution's actually going to be, but make sure you spend enough time, as much time talking about your people and your process and making sure that people are getting out, because that is really where success or failure is going to lie in a project. So, but otherwise, thank you very much, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
You bet. And as we wrap up today, we'd like to give a big thanks to Thom Sokol with Collective Insights. You can learn more at collectiveinsights.com. Big thanks to our sponsors, APICS Atlanta and the fine folks over at Talent Stream that help make this happen. Of course, a big thank you to our audience for participating. On behalf of Supply Chain Now Radio, this is Scott Luton wishing you all a wonderful finish to your week, and hopefully we'll see you next time on Supply Chain Now Radio. Have a great week, everybody.